Welcome back, guys and girls, for another Thursday Q&A. Today we are going to address two questions we got. One was just my go-to mobility exercises, and the other is difference in male and female weightlifting programming. Should there be a difference? Should there be a difference in programming and volume and intensity and all the above? So let's just kind of briefly touch on that one. It's always, as far as programming goes, it's always a little bit of a tough answer because it depends on who you're programming for, what you're programming for, and so on. In general, most people are probably going to do pretty good on just a regular progressive program that starts out with higher volume, lower intensity, and moves into higher intensity, lower volume as we start to peak. And then I like to work in regular kind of deload, either weeks or days within that to make sure that they aren't getting too beat up as they continue to progress through the anywhere from a 12-week and up a long program. So a lot of people will do really, really well on that. And the other thing to factor in is outside stressors. So when looking at programs, you want to find something that has enough volume and intensity that allows progression throughout the program, but also doesn't continue to increase their stress and keep their ability to recover too low. So we want to make sure that they're recovering well enough to have progression. And doing so, you have to factor in whether they are a full-time student, working full-time, have kids going through something, or if they are a full-time athlete. I think one of the issues people run into is they sometimes look at what these high-level or full-time athletes are doing and think that that's what they need to be doing. Part of the problem with that approach is you're looking at an end result. So really probably what you want to be doing is something closer to what they started out doing or something that they've been doing years and years before. And factor in if they are a full-time athlete, then they are probably very capable of recovering and doing two-a-days and doing more volume because they might not have a lot of the other stressors or time going into maybe a family or a full-time job or even a physical job or things like that. So, don't get too latched on with the idea that you need to be doing what the elite are doing. That's not always the best thing. That being said, let's circle that back around to differences in male and females as far as programming goes. Some will do just fine doing the same program. Where I've made the most adjustments with my athletes is during like the peak phase. I do find that women can do more volume closer to a meet than men can do. So I like to keep things like doubles and triples in the program for women much longer, much closer to the peak phase than men. And the way we'll usually go about doing that is it also kind of depends on the athlete. Some women do really well with hitting like maybe some heavy singles 4 weeks in a row leading into a meet. Others are going to want just like maybe 1 week of kind of testing something heavy as far as a single goes and then go out and compete. So a lot of that just comes with trial and error. So you take them through this general program, and then as you start to see how they perform and how they compete, you start adjusting that peak phase according to that. You make adjustments throughout the entire program, but we're talking specifically the difference between men and women. So then with the women, I usually have to adjust that peak phase to where we are maybe doing, heavy snatch doubles, when my men might be doing heavy snatch singles. And they just seem to do better with those higher volumes. And then a lot of times it's really beneficial too because they're sometimes doing those higher volumes at higher intensities than men can do those higher volumes. I've seen women take 2 to 3 reps in squats that are, close to their max, where men, there's a big difference sometimes between those 2 to 3 reps relative to their max. So being able to hit those higher intensities in multiple reps leading up to it tend to do really, really well as far as dialing in consistency at some of those higher intensities when we're getting ready for a meet as well. So I really like doing that kind of adjustment for women. Usually the way that runs for me, though, is I'll still have my team program, and then I will individually talk to those individual women and say, here where we're doing, we're 3 weeks out and you're supposed to be hitting a heavy single and snatch. What I want is doubles at 85 to 90%. And maybe that's what they end up doing instead. So then you just kind of individually adjust that. So don't get too hung up on thinking that you have to write a completely different program for your men and women, especially if you don't have the time to do that or if you don't have a really large women's team. But do consider that you might have to make some adjustments to the program for those individuals and for those women or men, whichever way you're programming directly towards, and be aware of making those adjustments. And really kind of figuring out how that peak phase goes is kind of like some of the more important stuff. That's when you're starting to test things, see how they compete, and then adjust some of that, and then see how it goes into the next competition. And you just got to kind of continue to roll with that. And then athletes, you sometimes got to let yourself go through that process so you can learn that about yourself. So maybe one meet doesn't go exactly how you want, then you make a few adjustments. Next meet, okay, maybe we did a little better, but we can make some few adjustments. Then you just kind of keep adjusting to where you have this personalized peak phase to where you get the most out of your performance. So that's usually the biggest difference I see as far as what I needed to adjust for programming for men and women. There's probably a lot more that we could go into, but keeping it simple or trying to test out something new, try testing out holding a little bit more volume for women through that peak phase leading into a meet and see how that goes. Let's get into my mobility go-tos. Let's talk real quick about what I kind of consider mobility and mobility practice. I think of mobility like a joint strength training, and I approach mobility exactly how I would approach strength training. So what that means is we're usually going to pick an exercise, and we're going to work on that exercise for repeatedly for a given amount of time until we see that area gets progressively stronger. So I do have some go-to movements that I like to do, and I like to do regularly because it allows us to also build strength on those areas. The ones that I like for, let's start with the shoulders, are like the pass-through. So taking a PVC or a band and starting with it in front of your body, taking it all the way overhead, back behind your body, or your arms are behind you, and back over your head. So we're taking that shoulder kind of through that full range of motion. And then, so we're maintaining that ability to take the hands behind our body, and then progressively adding a little bit of weight to that. Now that's going to be very, very progressively. With mobility exercise, you don't ramp it up like you do squats or anything like that. So we make sure that movement is very controlled, comfortable. There's no like accelerating, popping, arms bending or anything like that, awkward movement. Once we smoothen that out and it feels very smooth and strong, then we might add, a couple kilos. And then we've got the PVC with, a 2 kilo plate on it. And then we go through that sequence again for an amount of time until it feels strong and so on. So the pass-through is definitely one of my go-tos for the shoulders. The hips, I really like I always do some type of unilateral training with the legs through our accessory work. And so that's part of like the moving the hips in some different planes. But as far as like a mobility exercise goes, I really like the Caustic Squat, where you are straddled out, so your legs are in a straddle position, and then you're lateral squatting down to one side, basically as far as you can go while keeping your foot flat. And then the way that I like to perform it, instead of just going in and out of like that lateral squat type position, I like to keep the hips down low and shift side to side. So there are a few different ways of doing that. Now we do just the lateral squat, like the Caustic Squat, where you're just down, up and down on one side, up and down on the other. Huge benefits to that. You can easily progressively load it, hold a little bit of a kettlebell in a goblet position, do the same thing. um, or where you would kind of sit down to one side, and then as we shift from the left side to the right side, we're going to keep our hips as low to the ground as possible as we shift over to the other side, and almost kind of going through like that sumo squat position as we go to the other side. It's another good way of really getting in kind of deep into that hip and moving that hip in a different way than we normally do in your just standard pulls, squats, and things like that. So I like anything like that's a forward lunging type movement and a side to side lunging type movement. Those are usually always in the program. So that's shoulders, as hips. Those are kind of the big ones. For knees, I like what we call the natural knee extension, which is actually more like you're mostly working the flexion of the knees, where you're just sitting on your knees. So you're sitting straight up and down, but you're on your knees, on your shins. And then keeping your body straight, you slowly try to lower your shoulders back towards the ground. So that way you're flexing at the knee. Slow and controlled as far as my athletes can go without any pain or anything like that, and then pull themselves back up. So where we're loading this is you're using a little bit of your body weight to kind of add a little bit of load to it. You get good blood flow to the knee. As it gets better and better, we do have athletes that can sit on their knees, lower backwards, like they're bridging backwards, all the way to where their shoulders or head touch the ground and lift themselves back up. And we've even done to where some of them can hold like a 5 to 10 pound plate in front of them while doing the same thing. So the natural knee extension I like a lot. Now that can be a little bit intense for some. So something that I always have in our programs are just kind of like some knee prehab and rehab type movements. So things like wall sits, step downs. So we're doing like an eccentric, really slow step down off of a box. Some of those like patella tendonitis kind of rehab type movements, those are almost always in there. But the natural knee extension is usually one of my go-tos, but we'll always have something where we're working on the knees as well. So eccentric loading, slow step down, slow eccentric squats, or just like the static hold. So the wall sit's almost always in our program. So that kind of covers the major ones, the knees, the hips, the shoulders. Those are the big ones. For wrist, I've got a wrist flow. It's called my wrist routine. If you go to our YouTube, wrist routine explained, kind of walk the way through that. It's like a 1 minute routine that you can go through, and it hits everything from flexibility, mobility, and some strength training of the wrist. It's kind of my go-to there. Neck and spine, I like doing kind of the cars type movements, neck circles, spine glides, side to side, forward, back. More just like making sure that we're moving it regularly through a full range of motion. That's kind of the more important things to do. Things that I would program, though, for the spine would be like, cat-camel, cat-cow, those, however you want to call that, where you're on all fours and you're extending the back and then flexing the back. So you're just kind of going through those two movements, going through anterior and posterior pelvic tilt. So that way we just make sure that the spine stays fluid. Those are pretty common ones. Going a little bit into that posterior pelvic tilt every now and then to kind of help loosen up some of the extension that we're working in is good. So I would even consider something like a dead bug being some spine mobility work, because now we're taking that arch out of the low back and kind of holding that position. So that can be really therapeutic for the back. There are some of my go-tos that are usually always in the program. If you've got a more specific question, though, like for a specific joint or things like that, just let me know and shoot me a question on Instagram, C_Laughlin or at Blue Wave Weightlifting. I'll continue doing these Thursday Q&As. Drop me questions. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe. There should be a link over here to subscribe. If you're listening to this on any of the podcasts, Apple, Spotify, or anything else, it really helps if you give us a rating, and we'll continue doing these. All right, talk to y'all next Thursday.